that has obviously been big news as of late is that Aston Martin and Honda have signed a deal to use the Honda engine starting in 2026. Why does this partnership work? Why did they want to move forward together, Aston Martin moving on from the Mercedes engine?
Yeah, it came as I don't know whether a surprise, because if you think about it logically, it does make a lot of sense, but it kind of came as a big news story. And one of the big things here is that Honda is continuing in Formula One beyond 2025, which is when their current deal with Red Bull comes to an end. We know that Red Bull is making its own powertrains and they're putting a Ford sticker on them and they're having some technology transfer from Ford. So the Honda Red Bull relationship was at an end at the end of 2025, will be at the end of 2025. But Honda have decided that there's still potential in Formula One for what they want to do. The switch to renewable fuels and also the emphasis on a lot more power from the energy recovery system were two things that they think now aligns with what they want to be part of their kind of branding and messaging around the world. And Formula One is a very good way of spreading that. So then you look at who are the options, who are the teams available, and teams that do not have their own in-house engine production. So at the moment you have Ferrari have that, Mercedes have that, Alpine have that, and of course Red Bull will have that. So you've got four of the big teams in Formula One already with their own engine manufacturer. And then you start to look at who else. Well, the team that has emerged quite clearly as the one with a lot of potential and probably the most ambition and the funds to realize that potential is Aston Martin. And so it very quickly makes sense that the two go together, because when you look at Aston Martin and all the investment they've put into their new factory, building a new wind tunnel, obviously getting Fernando Alonso on board. We can talk about that later with the Honda thing, because that's an interesting subject. But the one thing they were missing, despite having these great designers, these great technical people involved, was their own engine and also their own gearbox and their own rear suspension, all of which they currently take from Mercedes. And while the Mercedes stuff is very, very good, to win and to beat a team, really you want to be designing all of that yourself. You want it so that your chassis is beautifully kind of crafted around the engine and vice versa. And you can't have that if you're a customer. And those, even if it's a small gain you get from things like that, and it's usually quite a big gain because you're talking about the whole concept of the car as well. That's what Aston Martin were fundamentally lacking compared to the top teams. So this is a step that I think Aston Martin needed to make. They weren't in a position to build their own engines. They don't actually build their own engines in the road cars that they produce. They take them from Mercedes, or in the case of the Valkyrie, Cosworth. And so they needed really to partner with someone who had all the technology and all the knowledge. The kind of company that is floating around wanting to stay in F1 currently produces arguably the best engine in F1, certainly one of the best, is Honda. And so it was a perfect match. And the other team I should mention as well, which is coming into F1 in 2026, is Audi with their own engines. So we've got all these different engine manufacturers. And I think if you're going to be a serious contender from 2026 onwards, you need to have a bespoke engine for your car. And that's what Aston Martin have now.
Really quickly, Lawrence, and I know the obvious reasoning behind this would be money, but why do some teams, some car company manufacturers create their own engines and others do not? Do you think that it's money that stops other teams? They want to get involved but just can't? Or what would be the reasoning to create your own engine, and what would be the reason to go the path of not creating your own engine?
Money is the biggest issue. To build a power unit facility alongside your factory that creates the chassis is a huge investment. So Mercedes, for example, which for a long time have had the best power unit in Formula One over the last kind of decade or so, they bought that engine facility from a company called Ilmor, which existed before. And then it took them a long time. They built some brilliant engines during the 2000s as well. But it's just, you need a huge amount of technology already existing, that already exists within the sport. You need to have that. You need to have the IP to it. You need to have the people there. And it's just this huge operation. And so Ferrari will always build their own engines, because that was essentially what they were doing right from the very start in 1950 when they were first on the scene. And then Renault historically have been in Formula One for a long time. They've got their facility in France. But to have that facility in the first place, it's such a huge investment. And so it usually comes down to car manufacturers and having the technology, because there is some technology transfer between the F1 engines and what ends up on the road. They're not directly linked usually, but there is certainly some transfer there. And there's also a huge amount of marketing benefits there. So really you need an OEM, a car manufacturer, to have basically the resource to do it and the willingness to do it, the technology to do it, the right people to do it. All of that is such a hard thing to get hold of. And car brands are very different in the way they're set up. A car brand like Aston Martin, while it's an incredibly iconic name in cars, it's a company that has really struggled in the past couple of decades or so just to exist, and so it's slowly stripped down, and it's being built back up now that Lawrence Stroll is involved. But from a building their own engines point of view, like I said, they don't even do it in their road cars, so to do it in Formula One as well would be just such a huge investment.
I'm interested because the progress that Aston has made in just 1 year, Nate, has been unbelievable. That's obviously been one of the biggest storylines this season thus far, outside of Red Bull's dominance. Now you look to the future, you throw in the Honda engine, that partnership. What is the potential if Fernando Alonso is still sitting in that seat come 2026? What is the ceiling for this team?
Yeah, it's huge. And I think there's still just, again, it's another reinforcement of just how serious Lawrence Stroll has been. Lawrence summed all that up really, really well. I think at some point, in these next couple of years, you'll probably see Mercedes, maybe not beating Aston regularly, but you're going to see the cap on Aston's performance because of that situation where they can't build their own engine. So I think it's huge. And I think that it's a really exciting time for Formula One. As Lawrence mentioned, Audi coming in, Honda now as well. It's going to be super competitive, you would imagine. When there's I say new, not new, but quote unquote new, with Honda coming back in again. I mean, it's super exciting. And that's the crazy thing, is that Aston has gone from, in the space of 6 months, has gone from being a team that really we were all looking at thinking, well, this team is really just not really living up to the hype. What was it last year? They finished sixth, or I think it was seventh actually. And now they're the only team that have regularly challenged Red Bull, or at least regularly been on the podium, and now have this incredible partnership coming up. So yeah, I think they've done huge things, and I would love to have been in the room when the name, the Honda thing was first pitched to Fernando Alonso, because he's got some interesting history there, and I think that's going to be a really interesting question for him on Thursday. Is obviously, he signed this deal for, I think it is until 2025. I think Fernando Alonso is just going to stay racing until he's not quick enough to do it. And given how good he is right now, I thought that this contract would be the last one he signed, the one for this cycle. But if he gets to that time, and especially if Aston are right there and ready to win a championship, you'd feel like he'd be ready to do that. But I don't know, maybe Honda have said, the proviso of this deal is you don't sign this guy, because the belief has been, because of the way his relationship broke down with Honda when they were with McLaren, there's rumors that...
Really quickly remind viewers, listeners who are unfamiliar with this.
So Fernando Alonso rejoined McLaren for a second stint in 2015, and that coincided with Honda and McLaren linking up, which was a very, very famous partnership from decades ago. And it was a complete disaster. They came in a year late. To say they were off the pace was an understatement. They were so slow, and we got to this stage where often you'd see Fernando Alonso struggling to even get out of Q1. The car was so bad. And probably the lowest moment of that was, I think it was the 2015 Japanese Grand Prix, Honda's home race. Fernando Alonso over the radio. We know how much Fernando Alonso loves a radio message that he knows is going to get broadcast over and over again. But he called the engine a GP2 engine. So GP2 is now Formula 2. So people who have joined Formula 1 more recently be like comparing Honda's engine to an engine from the lower Formula. Hugely insulting to say to an engine manufacturer. Even worse to say it at their home race. And it really started to sour things between Honda and how they viewed Fernando Alonso. He actually stayed with McLaren for a few more years, and they eventually split, and I think that, clearly they've been better since then. And so have Honda. Honda, they kind of went different ways. Honda's done much better without McLaren, and McLaren's kind of made progress. But what was interesting about that was when Fernando Alonso took his year out, and when he went to try and do the Indy 500 again, the common belief was, and this is has been widely reported, was he did it in 2017. He did it for Andretti with McLaren and Honda. When he did it in 2019, it couldn't be Honda. It had to be Chevrolet because Honda said there's no way we're giving that guy one of our engines. So, and he didn't qualify that year. So it became a huge thing, and they didn't let him do it. So obviously time heals all those things, and there's clearly much bigger things at play between Aston Martin and Honda than whether Fernando Alonso will be driving in 2026 or not. But it's just interesting that this career could come full circle back for Alonso, back to Honda, because I think when I first saw this news story, I thought, can you imagine Fernando Alonso winning a championship with a Honda engine? It would just be, given everything that's happened before it, it would be so bizarre to think of. So we'll see. We're obviously getting way ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I think whoever is driving in that seat, I think that seat is valuable anyway. If Fernando Alonso does walk away for whatever reason, suddenly, you've got a massive kind of seat there that I think every driver is going to want to be in.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube, and for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app, and for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.